Morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are listening to us from. Happy Tuesday. This is James Eastham, along with my co-host Andres Moreno, here to talk to you about you. And in episode 4 of the Believe in Serverless podcast, we're going to cover everything that happened last week from August the 5th to August the 10th. Let's dive into it. As a reminder, this podcast is to catch you up on what you might have missed. We'll cover the best unanswered questions from the Discord community, answer any pressing questions that went unanswered, and we're going to discuss the live sessions that happened last week and what we found interesting about them. In this episode, we're going to talk about if architects should be able to code, if platform engineering and DevOps are actually the same thing, the usefulness of low-code services, the CloudFront Worker runtime, diagramming, documentation, and a whole bunch of other things. But before we start rolling and get into all of that fun stuff, let's first thank our sponsor. And this week's sponsor is Memento, an enterprise-ready serverless infrastructure platform with caching, event messaging, and storage services. Memento is a pay-as-you-go platform with instantly available cloud resources that elastically scale to meet even your most demanding workloads. You can get started today for free by going to console.gomemento.com. Thank you to the entire team at Memento for sponsoring this best podcast, of course, and for your ongoing support of the Believe in Serverless community. Thank you again. Woo, indeed. Andres, how are you doing today?
I am doing great and very happy to learn that we have 8 new members this week in the community. So it keeps growing week after week. Lots of good conversation. Some people are active communicators. Some are people listening and learning. So if you are either of
Both are
those,
okay.
yeah. But let me give a shout out to our 8 new members. Again, these are Discord names and I might mess these up, but first we have a simple one. It's Iggy, and we have Log Gnarly, Gathigi Richard, Source. That's an interesting one.
That's an interesting one.
Francois Gas, Doc Fran SF, Sass Tar. I wonder if that's Bill Tar. Who would have thought? And then we got 0xFFEEDD. And doing a quick Google search, that is the bridal health color in heck. But I wonder if it's something else. I'm not good at hexadecimal numbers, so.
No, me neither. I'm just disappointed that you didn't try and pronounce that last one. Zeexfeedy, something like that.
Oxfeed. Oxfeed?
Oxfeed? Yeah, I suppose that's the easy way to do it. I was trying to get the 0 in there, but fair enough. It's so awesome, isn't it? Like, I think since we started doing this podcast from memory, there was 11 new members the first week, then 8, then 8. I think there's been 8 every week since then.
Yeah, it's been constant. So
it's so cool.
It's awesome.
Yeah, there's so much going on.
We're doing good stuff, pulling in new members, and this week was incredibly active in the chats on Discord. Very impressed. So many good conversations.
Yeah, yeah, I know. Except we get to talk about them all. We get to this. Yeah, is part of the beauty of it. So actually, where I wanted to start is technically, I suppose, going back the week before last, but the discussion carried into last week, and that comes from your podcast that you did with Alan, talking about App Studio. And actually, one of my favorite bits in the App Studio splash page, which was paraphrasing now, but the useful for people with no technical expertise, including enterprise architects, which I thought was a burn to enterprise architects everywhere.
Which Alan was, and I currently am. It's like, oh, this is.
Yep, I've been there. I've been an enterprise architect. But I thought it's an interesting discussion point. Like I said, this continued into the Discord, and I guess to pose the question to you, like, how do you feel about that in terms of, should architects be able to code? Should architects not need to code, and should be more bigger picture? Like, how do you kind of see that?
It definitely, architecture and architects should look at the broader picture vision, but and I've said this many times, the design only looks good on paper, right? Once you're actually in there and the developer starts doing it and the engineers start working through it, they'll find flaws in the design, right? And there's usually iteration around it. If an architect doesn't have that level of experience and with hands-on experience, um, I think you wouldn't have the level of kind of empathy in the maintenance you're probably gonna incur with a certain design. So you don't, it looks good, right? And as an architecture, and this goes from here to here, and we communicate perfectly, and it's all beautiful. But once at the engineering level, and once you're working with it, it might pose some pretty grotesque maintainability issues.
Yeah, absolutely. There's actually an interesting, I think it was a YouTube video, or it might have been a podcast I once listened to with Gregor Hoppe, Gregor from Enterprise Integration Patterns fame. And he talked about the idea that architects should be involved in, like, not necessarily on call, but they should be involved in production incidents. So they should be there in the room when these failures are happening, when things are going wrong, to see. That's the only way you can ever see the limitations of a system, is actually seeing it fail dramatically, badly, painfully. So I thought that was a really interesting idea, that actually architects should be involved in support, in testing, in on call. Maybe not, like I said, directly on call, but I think that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, it's just understanding kind of the what your decisions entail, right? And if you see it's like, oh, I decided to design it this way, but it provides a whole lot of issues around support and maintainability. Uh, it's a way for you as an architect to learn to say, okay, that's a trade-off. Maybe we're willing to trade off maintainability for better performance, security. Obviously, probably security should always be top tier, but
Yeah.
uh, you can evaluate your trade-offs better once you know what that entails.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think staying on the subject of Gregor and related to that as well, I think one of Gregor's books, The Architect Elevator, I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's such a good book about the role an architect should play in an enterprise. And it talked about this idea that really an architect should be able to ride the elevator from the penthouse to the, sat in the room with the execs, with leadership, to understand the direction that an organization is going in, the needs that the technology has, but then actually be able to take that elevator all the way down to what Gregor calls in the book the engine room, where things are actually happening, and actually be able to have them conversations with developers. You almost act as like a middle person between developers and the business itself. And I suppose whenever I think of the word enterprise architect, I think of that kind of ivory tower. I think it's become a bit of a lauded term, really, hasn't it? The word enterprise architect, that it's that. Because I've worked with some, what's the polite way of putting this? I've worked with some frustrating architects in my time who, yeah, but that arguably never even written a line of code in their lives. And then they're making big sweeping technical decisions about how a system should work.
Yep.
Where I think this, like, have a kind of bigger picture enterprise architect-esque type stuff can work well, though, is around one of the other discussions that was in the Discord this week. It's actually a discussion that I seeded. I've been reading an article online that was talking quite deeply about platform engineering, and I was reading the article thinking, this sounds an awful lot like the kind of DevOps movement. So the slightly clickbaity comment I put in Discord was, "Is platform engineering just DevOps? Discuss." But I think from that, if you're building platforms and doing kind of typical platform engineering, that's where having this bigger picture of, okay, well, 10 teams are all building their own their own messaging subsystem, whatever. That's where I think enterprise architect and this bigger picture stuff can be quite useful.
Yeah, and I think the enterprise architect and the platform engineer role kind of collide a little bit, and work together, right? It's a big collaboration there because you're identifying more of internal architecture. And I mean, an architect might know more about what every team is using, where a platform can consolidate it in the platform engineering. Whether that's DevOps, I think DevOps is a piece of platform engineering, but as the conversation went, there's a bit more around that, and it seems like it's more providing abstractions for shared things to provide better, faster software engineers, right? To be able to produce things in a shorter amount of time, which is what people usually want.
Yeah, everybody wants. do it as fast as possible with all the best practices packaged in. I think it's super interesting, this idea of platform engineering in a serverless context, though, because one of the things I've heard over and over again, and I think I might have said this in Discord, was, with serverless, the cloud provider is the platform. Um, I think if you're, I mean, when I was at AWS, I worked with a couple of customers who were building Kubernetes platforms, and they were building like abstractions on top of Kubernetes, which let's not go there. Actually, that's a whole other. That's something its own podcast.
Yeah.
But yeah, that to me is what I would consider like platform. You're building a Kubernetes platform that other developers could deploy on top of. But I think with serverless, it gets so interesting about what that actually means to be a platform engineer or build a serverless platform.
You're operating at a different level of abstraction because so much has been abstracted already, which is why
Hmm.
some people don't like it. But it's having that, yes, AWS is taking off a lot of the platform engineering from us because they take care of all the scaling and all that. There's still some fine tuning and all that, but that's going to vary from application to application.
Hmm.
So you can't really say, hey, you're going to run with 128 MB for the Lambda functions. Well, no, right? You can't because you might need one with 2 gigs, right?
Yeah,
So it is a different way to see it in serverless.
absolutely. There was a lot of talk though from I think both Ran Eisenberg, who's done a lot of content in this area, and Lee Gilmore as well. Lee's
Yeah.
talked about this a lot, about this idea of shared CDK constructs or shared Terraform modules or SDKs that allow you to just build quicker. Like one of my favorite ones I've used in the past in the CDK is like what I normally call something like a resilient queue construct, which gives you a queue, but also a DLQ and the ability to map a Lambda function. So then you've got all the stuff that you would need to do error handling, DLQ type stuff just built into a construct. So as a developer, you're just saying, I want a queue, but what you actually get behind the scenes is a queue, a DLQ, and all the batch response from Lambda, all that stuff just configured. So I think that's where the power comes, is these shared constructs, shared SDKs.
Yeah, it's more templating, basically.
Mm,
You're
mm.
providing templates for people to consume, which Ron has a huge one with the CDK and Python,
Oh yeah, yep.
with all the best practices. And he spoke about these in Believe in Serverless,
Hmm.
um, how as he learns, he starts including these in his, is this a serverless handbook? It might be. Um,
Yeah, cookbook. Because I did a .NET version
yeah,
of
the
it.
cookbook.
It's cookbook.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
he has everything there with the best practices, with power tools, with pumping out metrics and tracing, and uh, just how to define things in CDK and creating a new Lambda function, what it all includes. So having those types of things in serverless, again, it becomes more of a templating um, practice that people have to either start with or continue with, right?
Hmm.
You're creating a new Lambda function. Here are the best practices. This is what you start with, and you start fine tuning it to your own needs.
Yeah, because that was another really interesting point. I think that Ran also raised it, and apologies if it was somebody else and it wasn't Ran if you're listening to this. But that idea of talking about um, the balance that you need to find with abstractions. Like I think abstractions are quite a difficult thing to do sometimes because you're always going to have that one bit of a service or that one team who need that thing, and you're like, oh damn it, that abstraction I spent 6 months building is useless because they can't use it. So then they go and build their own thing. So I think it's a really difficult thing to do. I think is to get that just right.
Yeah, because people will find a way to work around any limitations, and that might become worse, less maintainable in the long run.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. There was some of the stuff around like CloudWatch alarms. So that's something I've never really thought of putting into a construct. Is like pre-configuring like alarmy type monitoring stuff, which I thought was really interesting.
So, I mean, you spoke about the SQSQ with the DLQ and
Mm,
all that, right? Things, and we haven't gotten to them where I work, but it's hey, I have a DLQ. Let's create the alarm. Let's create a
mm,
dashboard, right? And you can do all of that with infrastructure as code, right?
mm.
So I use SAM. You can define a CloudWatch dashboard and an alarm using SAM and just have it as part of your template where you would be able to get notified, right?
Mm.
From any issues happening in your system.
Yeah, and then it comes back to that last point though, where too many alarms, developers just end up creating
Yeah.
alarms, and they
Yeah. You got to be careful with
you gotta be
those.
so careful. Yeah, just constantly pinged off Slack 24 hours a day. I think we've all been. I don't think I know a developer who hasn't been there with alarm fatigue, where they've created something. They were like, "Yeah, we need that alarm. We need that alarm."
Open, close, just getting rid of the notification.
I'm just going to ignore that. One of the other, um, again, related back to your episode with Alan a couple of weeks ago, talking about App Studio. Um, One of the other things in there in that opening blurb, I feel like that blurb has got a lot of bashing inside Believing Serverless. So
Yeah.
apologies, AWS team, if you're listening. Um, but that idea that it's actually ready to build enterprise applications, and actually getting beyond App Studio just for a second, let's talk more general terms. This idea of like low code, no code services for building enterprise applications, letting anyone inside a business generate applications from AI and stuff like that. There was quite a bit of discussion about actually, are they ever going to actually go anywhere?
Yeah. And this one was a conversation I wasn't able to pitch in a lot because I was traveling last week. But I honestly, I've used a lot of low code platforms, or mostly one called OutSystems.
Okay.
Um, and I am pro low code, no code. This one is pretty unique in that it provides a lot of extensibility, and you can move away from it when you need, um, which does give you the ability to build enterprise applications. There's a lot of low code platforms. Most of them can't produce that, right? And that's where it's iffy, because this one that does produce enterprise applications is very expensive versus the Webflow, Bubble.io,
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yes, you can build good websites and stuff like that, but enterprise grade applications, it's tricky, right? And you
Mm,
get to the things Alan and I brought up with App Studio is that iteration, right? How can I work with a team of engineers to build an application, collaborate within the tool, and not have any issues, right? And that's where usually it falls off, where an enterprise application needs to be able to be highly iterative and collaborative, because it's not going to be one person building the app. It's going to be
mhm.
two, three, five. How do you test it, right? Can I add test automation on the just pure backend? Can I have a quality assurance and quality analysts running through the application testing? How easy is that? And that's where it usually gets lost, when you truly need a process to follow for enterprise grade application. And some of the low code, no code platforms don't allow for those.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So many of them would claim to be enterprise grade applications, but there's nothing on all of them things you've just said: testing, observability, CI/CD, blue green deployments. Like, I don't feel like
Yeah.
anything can be enterprise grade. I mean, the other way I think about this sometimes is kind of the same way I think about step functions, actually. So I used to be all in on like everything in step functions, whereas now I think I've kind of swayed back more towards in domain driven design. You've got this idea of core domains, supporting subdomains and generic subdomains. I think I've got that right. Um, and the stuff that's in your core domain is the stuff that differentiates you and your business. That's the stuff that makes your business your business. That's your USP. That's all your stuff. And for me, that's the stuff where you should be forking that actual engineering time, actual engineering effort. And personally, I would never use step functions for something that's actually core business logic, because if for whatever reason you need to move, that might not be moving cloud provider. That might just be moving to a different workflow orchestration tool or something. You can take that core domain logic with you. But for all the generic and supporting stuff, then yeah, offload as much of that onto somebody else as possible. But then when I come back to these low code, no code tools, I think like, well, I'd just buy an off the shelf product. I'd just buy like if I need an inventory management system, which I think is one of the things that App Studio, one of the examples it had, I would just buy an inventory management system, because then like I've got a team of humans supporting the software that I bought. So yeah, I think I'm with you. I think maybe there are some use cases, but um yeah.
Yeah, and it's yeah, the portability and all that. Yeah, definitely good use case, and you need to be able to move away from something at some point, right? Whether, like you said, core logic, but if it's very minimal, well, you can transfer
Mm.
easily. Um, yeah, I just love step functions, so don't you dare bash on them. No, I'm kidding.
And I love step functions. I just anything where I have to learn some proprietary language, i.e. ASL,
Yes.
I'm just for me, that's I don't want this to go into a whole like vendor lock-in conversation
Yeah,
because
yeah, yeah.
I don't think that's where we're going. But for me, that's the stuff that, if I'm writing code in .NET's been around for 30 years, Java 30 years, all these other languages that have been around for such a long time. If I'm going to write something that I have the potential to be able to move maybe at some point, and hopefully I never do have to, but if I did have to, I want that to be
Yeah,
something
you could.
that's
You
not.
have that. You have that protection,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
comfort. Yeah, like hopefully it's like an insurance policy, right? You have it there. You don't want to use it,
Yeah.
but if I have to, I'm prepared.
I like that analogy. Yeah, it's an insurance policy. I love it. I mean, related to these low code, no code tools, I think the other thing that maybe they could actually be better at, I suppose, is the idea of like documentation and actually generating documentation for how a system works. And this was another interesting area of discussion this week, talking about diagramming and visualizing infrastructure. And I've actually just listed all of the different services that were mentioned. So let's just go through all of these because during this conversation about diagramming, Cloudcraft, Lucidchart, Eraser AI, Mermaid, Draw.io, Excalidraw, there's probably more. And all
Of
these
course, yeah.
different services came up.
PowerPoint.
Pow- We're back at the enterprise architecture
Yeah.
conversation again, aren't we? Architecture diagrams in PowerPoint. Oh, we've all been there, hopefully. Um, PowerPoint, I love it. But yeah, there's so much choice out there, and I wonder if that is something that these like low code services could be better at because nobody likes writing documentation, nobody likes drawing diagrams. Could potentially a low code tool be better at generating these diagrams? I don't know. Are they even worthwhile? Is it even worthwhile having a kind of like what you said at the start, Andrews, about you know if an architect draws something on a diagram, does that really actually represent what it looks like in the real world?
Mhm.
Maybe, maybe not.
In a low code platform, it would be the other way around, right? It's representing what's already there because you already have the physical
Hmm.
resources. Um, and again, there are some that, yeah, print out your ERDs and you can start structuring them with your domains and subdomains and flagging them. And they do, again, way more expensive than your regular. Hey, I want to build an application and see if I can sell it. You
Yeah.
don't want to drop 50, 100K just to do that. So
Yeah, I think with anything like this, I always think keeping it up to date is one of the challenges. And I think some of the tools listed there, I know Cloudcraft does it. I think some of the others do as
yeah.
well, where they'll actually look at your actual deployed infrastructure.
And
But
then in serverless environment, because I've tried diagramming my infrastructure as code with my SAM templates, and it's pretty
Hmm.
weird. Once you have 30 Lambda functions and API
Mm,
gateway step functions and DynamoDB in the middle, the diagram becomes pretty nasty because it's not just diagramming those resources, it's also diagramming the IAM roles because they're part of the infrastructure,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
So if you're following principle of least privilege, every function has its own role. So
mhm,
then you have role here, role here, role here, and it just becomes pretty nasty. So diagramming your infrastructure as code might be a bit too much, but diagramming the general concepts around the architecture, here's the entry level with a API gateway. I have compute. It can be Lambda function, step function. That's a lot different, but those are manual, right?
mhm.
So
Yeah, I wonder if one of the ideas here could be um, leveraging your observability and things like distributed tracing to visualize how things. So, I mean, when you want to visualize your infrastructure, you want to just see how things talk to each other, what talks to
yep.
what, how are things integrated. I wonder if one of the better ways of thinking about this whole conversation is generate your diagram, and I'm doing in air quotes for anybody just listening to the podcast. Generate that from your actual observability data. Like I know Datadog can do that in a sense of if you publish a message onto SNS, SQS, Lambda, it will trace the SQS part, the
Mhm.
SNS part, and the Lambda part as three separate spans. And then you can actually visualize on a map, okay, well, this function talked to this topic, which talked to this queue, which talked to this function. So I wonder if that is a better way of thinking. And I'm sure other tools can do this as well, by the way. Um,
Yeah.
I'm sure that I wonder if that is a better way of thinking about these visualization conversations, use your actual observability.
Yeah. it's interesting, right? Because you mentioned Datadog visualizes this. So there's a way, right? But you're visualizing a, an action that happened, a single
Mhm.
action maybe, and how that distributed through the whole system. But if you're looking at the whole application, right? If you have a big application, you just want to see it all.
I want to
I
see
would have,
it all.
yeah, everything. It can get pretty crazy, right?
Yeah.
It's I work with an application right now where we have like around 150 Lambda functions, quite a few endpoints, quite a few step functions. So visualizing all that doesn't provide me any value because just off the bat, right? Visualizing a flow and how it interacted with all the system, yes. But just visualizing it's just overwhelming and you can't really make sense of it.
Looks pretty in PowerPoint though.
Yeah. Of course, just a little box, little black box.
And one of the last, I think there was a lot going on last week. One of the last
Yeah.
things that I wanted to talk about last week, and it seems like this is coming up more and more often. I'm seeing CloudFront. I think I can't go a day without hearing CloudFront be talked about. And I've used it, and I'm very, very impressed with the whole platform. Like it really is a fantastic thing, and it's so much more than just the CDN. I think that probably maybe a lot of people still associate, oh, Cloudflare is just a CDN, right? And there's so much more to it now.
Oh yeah.
And there was quite a lot of discussion in there this week about Cloudflare Workers, which is the Lambda or Azure functions or Google Cloud Functions equivalent. How they actually work under the hood, because it's really interesting how they actually do things. And I'm just going to open up the webpage that I'll put a link to in the show notes about how workers actually work. And what they actually do, they actually use the JavaScript V8 engine, which is the same engine used inside Chrome, which means the worker runtime also implements a lot of the standard APIs that are available inside web browsers. And this uses the idea of what's called isolates. So a V8 isolate is, if you imagine each tab in your browser is its own isolate, because you've got your banking app open and you've got Facebook open and you've got Twitter open and you've got your emails open. You don't want any of them browser tabs to be able to talk to each other. Like you don't want the owner of Twitter to be able to look inside your bank account.
Yeah. Yeah.
um, so that is something that's built into the runtime that Chrome uses. It allows you to isolate each of these individual tabs, and that's the same way that workers work. And that's really powerful because a lot of other, I think all the other serverless function providers, like Lambda, they use some form of containerized thing. So
Hmm.
inside Lambda, it's Firecracker. But what this isolates allows you to do is just to run these raw JavaScript processes, I suppose, inside the same instance, and they're all completely isolated from each other. So it's a really interesting approach as opposed to going down the containerized route that everybody else has.
Yeah. And I mean, it's very interesting to see how different things come up and people using it differently to provide more value, right? So I'm assuming what this causes and helps with is their ability to run faster. Is that part of
Mhm.
the? I know last week I'm kind of asking the question because I don't know much about kind of the explicit runtime, but I'm assuming these are the things that they're innovating on to be able to make things run faster, cacheable on the edge. Uh, what episode 2 of the podcast, we talk a little bit about CloudFront Workers as well.
Mhm.
Um, and just they provide like 4 millisecond cold starts or something like that, which is crazy,
Yeah,
right? And
it's
I think it's
crazy fast.
all this part of what they're doing and just thinking differently about um, the stack and how you can run your workers and
Mhm.
cache them. So
Yeah, I mean, one of the
cool.
ways I've been I don't know an awful lot about this either. For the record, a lot of what I've just said that sounds like I know what I'm talking about, I am reading from the page I've put in the description, just for full clarity for anybody listening. I am not an expert. But one of the things I've just thought about now, well, this is my own thought. This isn't me reading from the docs. Is if you think about when you like open a new browser tab, that browser tab is available to use like immediately. Now I know that's all inside my machine at the minute, but that must be doing the similar kind of thing of how Cloudflare workers work under the hood, in that they're just starting up a new isolate, a new tab, which is almost instantaneous. And you can do all
Yeah.
that inside the same machine. My Mac now in front of me has got all these isolates running inside them. So yeah, yeah. The more I read about how Cloudflare do things behind the scenes, I'm like, yeah, this is very, very cool. Just
Yeah. I
very,
need to
very
read
cool stuff.
some more of those white papers. I'll get on that.
Yeah, the one
So
about how they
interesting.
do I think I might have talked about this with Alan on the first episode, but there's some stuff they do where, let's imagine you've got a Cloudflare worker that's talking to said DynamoDB, and your DynamoDB table is in EUS1. And obviously, as a default, Cloudflare workers are going to run as close to the users as possible.
Mhm.
Behind the scenes, without you doing anything, Cloudflare is going to work out, are they better running your code in the edge location? Or are they better running all your compute in the closest region to EU West 1 and then routing your users over the internet? So they'll actually work out on the fly without you doing anything. You have to turn it on. It's called smart placement. But they'll
Okay.
actually work out
Wow.
on the fly. Is it better to run your compute close to your data or close to your users? I'm like, what?
That's pretty wild.
Crazy. Their head of I think it's their head of engineering. I listened to her on a podcast, and she was talking about the idea of like the region is the world. Developers shouldn't have to care about which region you're in your code in. Your code should the provider should provide that, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. Another Yet another level of abstraction that we can see in the future.
What I also the other final note I'll make on Cloudflare Workers is that because they use this V8 runtime, which is a version of the web browser APIs, which then supports WebAssembly, means yay for Rust. Woo!
You got it in there.
I got it in there. My aim going forward is to get Rust into
I
every
just
web app.
see you and Ben just high-fiving right now.
Yeah, virtual high five. Yeah, every time one of us says, if I had a penny.
Yeah.
uh, so yeah, I mean that was they were the highlight. There was a lot more in the community than what me and Anderson talked
So
about today.
much. It's so much going on. I love it.
Yeah,
Lots of good
yeah,
conversations and very different topics.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I get a little dopamine hit whenever I open Discord, and I'm like, ooh, there's a new conversation. You believe in serverless? Yay!
Interesting. Yeah.
What's going on? Awesome. So that brings us to the kind of the end of the first part of the podcast. Now, if this is your first time listening, now this is where we try to look at any unanswered questions that happened in Discord last week. And there were a couple of unanswered questions, or questions that kind of had a bit of an answer, but not really anything and committed, that I thought it would be interesting for us to chat about. And the first one is from Paul Gledhill. So I know Paul really well. He's here in the UK. And he was asking, I'm going to try and paraphrase some of this. I don't want to read the whole thing. Um, but Paul's at the minute basically supporting the hiring of a principal engineer at work. And he's got pretty strong opinions on what that IC career path should look like. And basically, Paul's question is when do we think it's the right time to be a staff or a principal engineer? And does anyone know of any good resources on the subject? And Paul, your resource is me and Andres talking about it now. So here's your resource on the subject. So yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? The reason I'm going to kind of defer a lot of this to you is because I've never actually been. I've worked in a consulting for a lot of my career, so I've never actually really been in the typical kind of IC career path for an engineer. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
And this is a very interesting topic around any title in the industry
Mhm.
because what that means might vary from company to company, right? And in some companies, you might grow faster to an architect and a principal engineer than some others, right? There's those, and it's just relative to the people that the company has,
Mhm.
right? So because he mentions it's just because you're a good senior doesn't mean you're ready for a principal, right? There's a
Yeah.
lot of more responsibilities that come with a principal, probably some more cross team functionality. You're not just focused on a single team. There's some level of architecture that you have to do and design, at least from my experience. But it's I'm in a weird state because I was a principal engineer for a team that did not have an architect, so I was acting architect as well.
Yeah.
Uh, so my perspective, again, it changes from industry to industry and based on the resources you have. So I was acting as two. So my opinion might be flawed a little bit because of that. But I think there's a lot of communication that needs to be um, good from the engineer, right? They can communicate at different levels, right? You
Mhm.
can communicate with customers, you can communicate with your product teams, your user experience teams, with your developers, right? So and it's different levels of communications. And we were talking about the diagrams. They're different diagrams depending on who you're talking to, right? So uh, we probably all know engineers are not usually the best communicators, right? So that's a skill you have to grow
Mhm.
as you're going through your career. It's not just I can type in a lot of stuff and get work done, right? That's not what it is about, right? So that's what usually highlights a good senior engineer.
Yeah.
It's yes, you should pay attention to communication a lot at every level, any level you're growing. But it's not just hey, he can pump out a feature in a week instead of
Mm.
2 weeks for everyone else, right? That's not all.
Mm. Yeah, your typical, I suppose, like 10x engineer may not
Yeah.
necessarily be the right person for a principal. I think I'd agree with you. Like from my experience working in places I've worked, anyone with a principal something title tends to become a bit more cross-functional. You said it. Like you start doing almost, I would say, in some levels, like some ways, like an architect's type role. Like you start to do a lot more of the cross team. I think at AWS, the principal engineers used to do a lot of like, you know, Andres, you have an idea of a new thing you want to build before it can go live. It has to have a principal engineer's review on it, and they'll think about will it scale, will it be resilient, will it be secure? Like they'll kind of ask all them ilities type questions that architects typically worry about. But it's a really interesting question. I think you put it perfectly. Like company to company, like you say, your experience of being a principal, but you were actually more kind of an architect, maybe because there was no architect, and then you could go somewhere else, and a principal engineer could be like all engineering, and maybe you're expected to be a 10x engineer. So it's going to be so different
Yeah.
company to company. But yeah, I'd say reading the rest of Paul's question, expectations in terms of job role, impact, qualities. I think communication. You said it. I think that's
It's one of the harder skills to evolve into, right? So, and not once I'm mentoring people, it's like just communicate. Don't be afraid of communicate.
yeah.
Don't be afraid of asking questions. Don't ask the same questions, but don't be afraid of asking questions, and just talk to people. It's have conversations, whether they're informal, whether they're formal, right? Because
Mm,
at some
mm,
point you'll be paired with the customer, and it's a whole different conversation than if you're talking to your peer about a function, a variable name, right? So it's communication is a key point. And I think I mentioned it in one of the video series from Marcia Vialba on how to get your first cloud job. And I mentioned this, right? It's communication is
mm,
what might differentiate you from the rest of the engineers
mhm.
because we come from a place where there's not a lot of communication. You're locked in probably a dark room trying to code. I'm definitely not. If you can see the sun's coming right into my face, but and that's what we're used to seeing coders, right? And you see a little GIF, whatever you call it,
Mhm,
and it's a dark room with a little hoodie,
mhm.
right? That's the expectation of a coder, a hacker, right? But we never talk about the communication skills that people need to grow into. And I think as you grow in your career and start climbing that ladder, communication is key.
Yeah, and I think just to like clarify with all of this, like communication doesn't mean that you have to come on a podcast like we are now, or you
Yeah,
have to be
no.
like public speaking. You have to be like you don't necessarily need to be vocal externally, but yeah, being able to express your ideas, to talk about the things that you've done, like all of that kind of stuff is super important. Cool. The other unanswered question that was in there that we kind of talked about before we came online, and I'm now debating whether I'm going to steal Andres' thunder or not, and I don't think I'm going to. I think I'll let you have it. It was a question from Omid, and I'm gonna again paraphrase, but basically Omid's saying that he doesn't like coding for nothing. Nobody likes coding for nothing, like writing code that isn't going to be useful. That's why we all love serverless, right? Because we remove a whole bunch of things that we no longer need to worry about. But Omid he needs to make some API calls to a partner, and the contract with the partner has a monthly limit. And if the limit gets exceeded, there's nothing going to break, but there will be a bill for an extra cost per call. So what he's wondering if there's a way is to add alerts if 80% of the limit is reached within the month. And to do that in a way which requires no additional coding. So he suggested either using CloudWatch metrics or in the past he's done it with Datadog custom metrics, but he's using CloudWatch at the minute. Any ideas, Andrew, on how you might manage that?
It's tough, right? And obviously it depends on the provider. But what we were talking about earlier was this should be the provider's job to give you these metrics, right? And hopefully they have some event streaming or webhooks you can tie into. Again, it will require you to code, but maybe they have direct integration with Slack or
Mhm.
Teams whatever method of chatting you have, to notify you, which is just clicking button and not so much coding to configure it. A lot of tools provide this, right? So I was just on my Google Drive saying, "Hey, you're about to run out of your allocated space," right? So I will. This one will block me off, and I can't upload files anymore. But the fact that this one you can keep going is nice because you don't want it to break the system, but now you're going to get charged for it at probably a higher price than the allocated thing you already paid monthly for. So yeah, I think it falls on the provider to provide a mechanism to give you that information easily with some sort of like alerting, right? And in CloudWatch or Datadog, you can tie it directly into Slack channel, and that's what you're tracking. And hey, I get it on my phone. I can see
Mhm.
I'm having issues.
Yeah, I wonder if, like, interestingly, I think it's back to this idea of trade-offs that we all deal with all the time, isn't it? Like, do do you want to are you happy to pay? And if you're happy to pay, then it kind of becomes irrelevant because you're happy to pay it. You'd rather not, but you're happy to. The alternative, if the provider was to not necessarily provide some kind of like event streaming, but just the ability to cut off, just to stop, that in itself would be useful, right? Because if you don't want to pay, then
Yeah.
you could just get cut off, and then you'll start seeing 500 to whatever your errors will be, DLQs, build up into DLQ, and then you can carry on again on the first the next month. But yeah, I think it depends what you're optimizing for. Because if them API calls absolutely have to happen, well, kind of need to pay anyway, because them API calls, don't they? So
Yeah. Yeah,
uh,
it's weird and something a lot of people ask for from AWS, right? It's I have these personal projects and I might spin up like Khawaja last Friday, spin up an EC2 instance that I forget to turn off. Um, I want to have for me, for my personal accounts, I want to have a limit of $10 and cut off, right? Just
mhm,
shut it down. Don't let anything more come through. Um, which would be nice for those kinds of things. For enterprise grade applications, which I know nothing about because I'm a
yeah, express that.
but it's for those, obviously you can't just cut them off because each request is making you money. Hopefully each request is making you more money than what it's going to cost you,
Yeah, yeah,
even if
yeah.
you overflow. So a lot of considerations there around cost and your industry. Maybe it's fine if it's down for 2 hours while you
Mm,
refill that bucket to be able to consume a little bit more. Um, it changes, but yeah, without coding right now, I see, oh man, sorry, I don't have a good solution other than blog posts that help you how to do it faster.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, DynamoDB counters was where my first thought went. It's just increment a counter in a table. Every time it happens, it'd be pretty minimal code, but yeah, it's still additional code, right? Um,
Yeah, I mean, CloudWatch and Datadog metrics are good because you can then have alarms around it to notify you, right? So those are
mhm,
where you can have a little bit more um,
yeah,
features or than DynamoDB counters. But yeah, I mean, however you report it, may have it checking hourly and sending you an email of how
yeah,
much you produce. Probably not hourly because then you'll skip them, but maybe daily.
yeah. Maybe there's something in like CloudWatch login sites and being able to run like custom CloudWatch queries to infer the data from Logme. I don't know, something like that. Maybe that could work, I suppose. But you did just mention, interestingly, actually, Kawaja's live stream last week with you hosted. I think actually you were on there with.
Yeah.
Weren't
Yeah,
you?
I was there. I was there trying to sound smart and stuff, that's what I do.
The clips I listened to, he was talking a lot about math and doing maths, and I was like, okay, I did
Yeah.
math. I know I'm a programmer, but I'm not bad. I don't like maths. So let's actually have a listen to one of the clips we pulled out from last week's live stream, and then we'll have a chat about it. So let's just play that now.
It looks like it's about 30 milliseconds or 77 milliseconds or so to get the up and running. All right. But this is because it's on my laptop over a Wi-Fi. And, and I live close to Portland. I live one city north of Portland and in Vancouver. But I promise you, this latency, it is only due to my Wi-Fi. It's not it's like the speed of light from here to the Portland data center is not that high. Um, so we know that my laptop can send and receive this message in a matter of, you know, 30 to 150 milliseconds. Let's actually get to a more reliable internet. And I'm going to commit a sin of serverless by going and provision a server. So I have, 2 instance.
Ah,
I love the end of that clip. You just hear you go.
ah. It wasn't that bad.
So for anyone actually who just heard that clip, so what Khawaja was trying to do last weekend, he was trying to determine latency between regions, right? That was kind of the purpose of the live.
Yeah, so he started, and it was kind of showing the latency between kind of communication between regions and topic and setting, basically subscribing, publishing from different places. And he went and grabbed the, what is AP, Asia Pacific region, and then just getting all the latencies from different spots. And I was pretty impressed. It's from within the same region, publishing and subscribing, right? So US East 1, let's say, he was getting, like, once he moved to the EC2 instance, right? Because he was testing with his laptop and Wi-Fi, that first test, that's the video clip. He was getting between 40 and 60 millisecond latency. Once he moved it to the cloud, right, without that Wi-Fi and physical limitations, he was getting 3 average millisecond latency, publishing, subscribing. Boom, 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 boom. So it would just go fast.
Nice. And that's
Oh.
between the producer sending the message and the subscriber receiving
The subscriber
That's the
receiving it.
latency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So pretty incredible stuff, and gets you thinking how fast things can really be if you don't have the kind of limitations with your bandwidth, and he would probably get a different result if somebody at his house was watching Coco Melon, right, or something on Netflix. So there's a lot of physical restriction or limitations that people tend to forget when asking for what's the latency your APIs are going to have. It's like, well, I know my Lambda function is going to run for this amount. API gateway is going to add this level of latency. And then I don't know what you have. So it might take a little bit longer for you to receive this message. So it's pretty interesting. I recommend people to watch that talk because it's Khawaja, very fast paced, going through EC2 instances, and setting all that up. And it looks pretty incredible once you start looking at those numbers.
Yeah, it's impressive stuff. I'm sure I remember seeing a thread recently on Twitter to your point about like latency. Is there not a way in like Chrome in the dev tools you can like force restrict your browser? Is that how I imagine that? I'm sure that because that's one of the things when I was doing a little bit of front end dev, that was one of the things I always found really hard. Even building APIs, right? You'd be like, oh, my API responds in 100 milliseconds, for example. And then you're out on 4G. I was learning Google Cloud recently, so I built myself a little app on my phone for tracking my gym workouts. And when I'm at home, I'm like, this is fantastic. And then I'm in the gym where the Wi-Fi is 4G, and I'm like, this is very slow.
Yeah, it's very different. There's definitely a way in Chrome to test at different speeds. If you want to really test with different latency, you can even put in offline. That's something I've done since we work a lot with at Tyler right now. Where the application I'm working with, it's file uploads and stuff. So working with retry mechanisms and being able to resume a failed upload, you would go into Chrome and put it as offline. So you can even set it to offline to test kind of your reconnectivity once you come back online, which is pretty interesting.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, like WebSockety type stuff where you need to disconnect and reconnect.
Yeah.
Cool. Awesome. Well, that was actually the only live stream we had last week, albeit a fantastic one. Of course, the link to that talk will be in the notes, and it is on YouTube, available to go and watch. I've caught bits of it. There's a lot of math, but yeah, it seemed like a really cool talk. So in terms of upcoming events, then we don't actually have any events coming up this week, but we do have a couple of talks, 2, maybe 3 talks coming next week. So next week on Tuesday at 6 p.m. BST, which I think is about 1 p.m. Eastern, the number of maths. Luciano Mamino is going to be, it's in here a second time. Luciano is going to be talking about Rust, harder, better, faster, stronger Lambda functions with Rust. So that'll be really cool to hear from Luciano. And then on the 22nd, so next Thursday at what I guess is 7 p.m. BST and 2 p.m. Eastern, we've got another speedy talk: serverless speed, Rust versus Go, Java, and Python. Disappointed there's no .NET in there. I'm not going to lie, but that's fine. I'll get over it. Talking about the different performance of the different runtimes with Lambda functions. And then we may have one more talk. So Sam Lott was supposed to be giving a talk on Thursday this week. That is probably going to be moved to next week. Sam has messaged me while we were recording saying that he can't do this Thursday. So
okay. I was going to correct you there.
yeah. So that talk's going to move to next week. We'll just work out a time with Sam for that. That's going to be on making a case for relational databases in serverless applications, which could be interesting.
There's one other thing that just popped in this week, and we'll confirm, but we have serverless feud tomorrow morning.
Of course we do.
With Alan Helton versus Michael Liendo for the, it's a new competition. We're going to see it. We're playing it out. We'll see how it works out. Again, I'll confirm because Sam Locke is hosting that one. So I want to check what the reason of the possible reschedule tomorrow is, or Thursday is. But I'll be there. I'm going to be part of Team Allen. So we're going to play Family Feud style game with
nice
questions around serverless.
Hopefully there's some questions in there about building fences, because I know you've been building fences recently.
I'm an expert now. And I'm trying rethinking my professional life. I might go and start build fences now.
I always think that one of my friends, I'm doing some work done on my house at the minute, and one of my friends, he's a builder, roofer. And it must be wonderful at this time of year. And then I imagine any of these outdoorsy jobs, once it gets to, November, December, January,
yeah,
less exciting. At least in the UK, it's a lot less exciting.
It was fun, but I think it was two of the hottest days in Dallas to be outside for.
Obviously, that's just the timing.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's what we've got. A whole bunch of stuff coming up as always, and there's if you want to come and join the Discord community, as you can tell from the podcast today, there's so much discussion happening in there, so many different topics, and there's stuff that we've missed today, right? And there's stuff that was talked about, and we just don't have time to cover all of it. So if you are interested, come and join the Discord community. If Discord isn't your thing, of course, this podcast will be coming out every week to talk about the thing that happened the week before. Thank you everybody for tuning in. Thank you all for listening. We appreciate any feedback as always, so please let us know. Andres, thank you for joining me, and we will see you all next time.
Thank you, James. This was great.
Since